Fantastic. Well, look, it's great to be here. So I'm so glad to be invited. There are lots of things I could have talked about. I told Inga that we were exchanging emails, and there are a variety of different possible topics. It seems that all of you have a predilection for French Marxism, so that's what I'm going to be discussing in a bit more detail today. And I should say that my interest in Marxism and the history of Marxism comes very much as a historian of modern Europe. I uh, I'm interested in the intellectual history of particularly post-war Europe. I'm writing an intellectual biography of Eric Hobsbawm, obviously the Marxist, very famous Marxist historian, and that's led me down various different alleyways, if you like, of Marxist history. But the stuff I'm going to be talking about today is actually related to much older work that I've been doing for a long time, and that is work on French politics, and in particular on the French left. And I've written about this, and you know, those of you who are curious can go and chase up some of my my broader writing about French politics. And what I want to talk about today is I want to talk about French anti-capitalist thought, and the so-called neoliberal turn. And when I'm discussing these things, I'm talking about them as a historian rather than as a kind of as an activist, and I'm trying to sort of think about the neoliberal term as a sort of historical moment and what that means. And in particular, I'm interested in how the intellectual left in Europe has tried to respond to this neoliberal turn, which has corresponded in many cases with some pretty severe political and strategic defeats for the left. And I find this really quite interesting because not only does it get us into the history of Marxism in interesting ways, but it also helps us to think about how intellectual history and the world of ideas relates to the world of politics and to the broader sort of universe of geopolitics. And the way I want to do this is I want to try and track some of the ways in which Marxist and Marxist-inspired thinkers have, in a way, responded to the neoliberal turn through these four texts that represent, in some ways, some of the most famous texts that these people have written. The four texts, as you can see on the screen, are André Gort's Adieu au prolétariat, Goodbye to the Proletariat, written first published in 1981, written in the late 1970s. The second text I want to discuss is an essay that is contained in that edited volume, or that volume of Debré's you can see on the screen, called Contretemps, Éloge des idéaux perdus, so a eulogy for lost ideals. And the essay I'm going to be talking about is one entitled République ou démocratie, Republic or Democracy. The next book on the list is one I expect many of you will be familiar with, The New Spirit of Capitalism, in its English translation by Luc Boldowski and Eve Capello. And finally, another book you might be familiar with because it was translated by Verso in 2014 is La Nouvelle Raison du Monde, The New Reason of the World, I think it is in English, by Pierre Dardot and Christian Laval. And these four texts, I think they give us a quite interesting insight into French intellectual life more generally, and we can perhaps talk about that later, but specifically into the ways that French Marxist or post-Marxist thinkers have grappled with some of the different challenges they've faced. Now, obviously, in a really short talk like this, it's not possible to get into the text in great detail, and perhaps again we could do that later. I'll try and give very short summaries of the arguments for those of you who are not familiar with them, so that you're not completely at sea. But actually, what I'm going to focus on much more is the way that the idea of power is conceptualized in these four texts. And what I'm going to argue really is that as neoliberalism became a dominant global ideology in the 1980s and the 1990s, its critics, in this case its left-wing critics, discarded more rigid structural notions of class, of the proletariat, of the ruling class, and replaced them with more fluid ideas of power, such as spirit or rationality in relation to capitalism and other things, that were better adapted to the age of rapid globalization. And what you're going to see, I hope, is that in all four texts, there's an attempt to isolate the increasingly unstable and decentralized sources of power in a neoliberal world and propose alternatives, which range very widely depending on the author, from political ecology to the state regulation of markets. And I think this range of solutions actually reflects the diversity of intellectual genealogies at play in each of the texts, but also, I would argue, the kind of atomizing tendency of neoliberalism itself, right? In this sort of world of market-driven pluralism, of individualist democracy, left-leaning critical thinkers like the scholars and intellectuals you see on the screen in front of you first had to identify who or what actually held the reins of power before suggesting how that power might be modified, curtailed, or dismantled. So basically, they're trying to analyze power in order to understand how to attack power, how to dismantle power. Okay, so let me dive straight into the four texts for today. The first, as I mentioned, is André Gort's epoch-making, really quite famous text in the French context anyway, Adieu au prolétariat, au-delà du socialisme. So the French subtitle is Beyond Socialism. And it was published shortly before the socialist victory in 1981, which saw the French Socialist Party sweep to power under the tutelage of François Mitterrand. And Gort, by this stage, was already quite a prominent thinker amongst the dissident non-communist left in France. And he was quite influential amongst French trade unionists, particularly on the non-communist left. So this is, for those of you who know a bit about France, is associated very much with the CFDT, which was a trade union that was not affiliated to the Communist Party. And Gort himself had been publishing since the 1950s, both as a philosopher and as a journalist. He had developed a really interesting fusion of a sort of Sartrean existentialism with his own ideas of environmentalism and political ecology. He'd been very involved with Les Temps Modernes, which was Sartre's journal in the 60s, before sort of breaking away from that and eventually becoming the founding editor of Le Nouvel Observateur, one of the best known magazines still in existence today, left-leaning magazines in France. And what's interesting, actually, on a personal level, is that in contrast to the very sort of classic model of the self-aggrandizing French intellectual who thinks a lot of himself and his ideas, Gort was very, very scholarly, very, very committed to a critique of capitalism, but within really quite a modest personal and intellectual framework. So why was the book such a hit? Well, the title is, the clue is in the title, right? The book essentially laid out a very strident critique of this classical Marxist notion of the proletariat, which was, according to Gort, both philosophically and empirically problematic. Philosophically, and he argued this, but philosophically, because in order for the communist revolution to take place, the working class would have to negate itself by renouncing the wage labor that formed the basis of its identity. Right? Empirically, the notion of the proletariat was problematic because there was less and less evidence that anything resembling a proletariat could exist in a flexible, advanced capitalist society. Bearing in mind now we talk about the late 1970s, the early 1980s. And he argued that the increasingly desperate attempts on the part of socialist and communist movements to identify and speak on behalf of the proletariat were thus doomed to failure. And he also argued that the idea of workers' power or a dictatorship of the proletariat, which were fashionable ideas among certain currents of the European left at the time, were little more than a kind of fantasy. The proletariat, if it had ever existed, was much less likely to become a reality in the 1970s, 1980s, he argued, than ever before. And Gort argued that the real problem with capitalism wasn't its class structure, but its fetishization of wage labor and its utilitarian vision of work. And the claim that he made, the strong claim he made in the book, was that the left needed to concentrate not on liberating a fictitious proletariat, but on abolishing the capitalist conception of work and replacing it with a more holistic and fulfilling attitude towards work. Now, a lot of this stuff will probably seem pretty familiar to you guys because we are now at a time when many of André Gort's assumptions are taken for granted. But he was quite unusual, both in the French context and in the European context at the time, in making these very, very strong arguments against workerist and worker-orientated socialist politics. Now, what I find really interesting about this book, in relation to sort of the thesis I laid at the beginning about power, is that Gott, what he does in the book is he basically tries to push Marxists to think beyond frameworks of power that emphasize class conflict, and he tries to push a number of he tries to push his sort of colleagues to think about creating spaces for individual autonomy that might be beyond the reach of capitalist accumulation, as he put it. So Gott was very committed to a sort of almost like an idea of capitalist or of anti-capitalist autonomy, that is, of creating structures that would operate beyond capitalism. And I think what's interesting is that in these arguments, what he does is he begins to mirror the arguments that neoliberals and neoliberalism more broadly is making at the same time. So in the same way that neoliberalism is emphasizing, if you like, the importance of individuals and of choice, Gott is talking in terms of individual autonomy and the diffusion of power, trying to break down sort of power structures. Except, of course, in the case of neoliberal ideology, this tends to be in the service of capitalism. In the case of André Gott, it's very much part of an anti-capitalist project. But nevertheless, the power of Gott's critique, I think, and one of the reasons his book became so successful was that it seemed to work with rather than against the sort of emerging ideological and socioeconomic configuration of the 1980s. Okay, moving on to the second book in this sort of greatest hits of French Marxism. Now, if you know anything about Régis Debray, you'll know that he's a very different kind of thinker and a very different kind of Marxist to André Gott. And indeed, the essay that I'm going to be talking about, this essay called Republic or Democracy, which was published at the end of the 1980s, is totally different to André Gott's text. I mean, from what I remember, it only includes the word capitalism once. Very much a text that seems unmoored from his Marxist, from the Marxist roots of Debray. But I think what's interesting about it is that Debray takes this question of power in a very different direction. Whereas Gott talks about autonomous spaces beyond the reach of capitalism, Debray sees the state, and in particular the French Republican state, as a necessary bulwark against capitalism. So where Gott argues that power is sort of diffused through the industrial system, Debray contends that power lies with the media and with the image, and where Gott argues for that kind of individual emancipation from work, Debray maintains that a rational Republican state is the only way to transcend the sort of the poverties of neoliberal capitalism. Now, for those of you who don't know, Debray was already a pretty well-known philosopher and intellectual by the late 1980s. He had spent some time in Latin America as part of Che Guevara's guerrilla movement in the 1960s, and he'd been one of François Mitterrand's advisors in the early 1980s. But it's interesting that it's a particular context that brings Debray to talk about republicanism and the republic and the state in France. And that context is the so-called headscarf affair in France, which erupts in September 1989, when 3 teenage girls are expelled from or suspended from a school in Paris for wearing the Islamic headscarf. And they are suspended on the grounds that the wearing of religious symbols in a state school contravenes the values of the republic. And Debray had hitherto not said very much about republicanism or the state, but he intervened in this debate in this very incendiary essay, which is widely republished in the French press. And the core argument that Debray is making in his piece is that there is a profound normative distinction to be made between a republic, capitalized with a capital R, and democracy with a capital D. And in his view, a republic corresponds to the public incarnation of enlightened rationalism, while a democracy is simply the expression of society's collective opinion. And what's particularly interesting to me in this context is that Debray's discussions of democracy focus a lot on its relationship with business, advertising, and the media. right? And so he argues that in a democracy, public opinion is a law and money trumps everything, and the client is king. By contrast, in a republic, the sort of power of the republic lies in its institutions, in the public good. So the democracies, for Debré, at least in the argument he makes this book, are a reflection of a neoliberal consumerist society, and the Republican ideal offers a necessary counterpoint to that. And in this text, which said became very famous, Debré is really unambiguous about the need for this strong, rational, central authority in the form of the Republican state. And he argues that, as a repository of national memory, cultural heritage, and Enlightenment values, the Republic, he talks about the Republic in the abstract, he's normally talking about the French Republic, is the only possible bulwark against the decadence of democracy and the financial values of capitalism. And so for Debré, emancipation in the Marxist sense passes through the Republic and its secular institutions. That is, the state is a form of liberation. Not only does it protect citizens against neoliberal capitalism, but it provides an opportunity for emancipation. Now, this very statist and sort of neo-republican defense of the French Republic has been widely criticized for its elitism, for its ethnocentrism. It's interesting about Debré, even though the arguments are really radically different to those that Gort makes in his book. You see in this period of the late 1980s, early 1990s, quite a number of left-wing intellectuals and left-wing politicians draw on the same sort of arguments as him. You see them using the idea of the Republic, the French Republic, as a defense against multiculturalism, against so-called communitarianism, against Anglo-Saxon capitalism, against neoliberalism. And this tendency was given its clearest political expression, I think, in the no vote in the referendum over the European Constitution in 2005, which marked, in a sense, a culmination of that discourse in French political sphere more generally. And I think in retrospect, looking back now, when we sort of look at this panorama, you can see how Debré's essay signaled the arrival of a new kind of anti-capitalist discourse, very much focused on the state and on the protective power of the state. And it kind of sets up this tension, really, which then carries through, I think, into the next two books between statist and non-statist responses to that neoliberal term. All right, moving swiftly onwards to our third book here, the Boltanski's and Capello's A New Spirit of Capitalism, which was published in 1999. Now, this was distinct from the two previous texts in that it tried to explain not simply what was wrong with advanced capitalism, but also why contemporary critiques of capitalism and neoliberalism had failed to have much impact. And I think this isn't surprising, given that the book was conceived at a time in the mid-1990s when all hopes of a strident left-wing critique of neoliberalism seemed to have evaporated. The collapse of the Berlin Wall, the end of communism in Europe, had confirmed the resounding victory of liberalism and democracy. And in the domestic sphere, Mitterrand's defeat in the 1995 elections marked the end of a long and difficult period of socialist rule, during which many of the kind of cherished values of the French left had been pushed aside in the name of austerity and pragmatism. And what this meant was that it was urgent for those on the left to identify and conceptualize power. And this was obviously something that Gort and Debré had also tried to do, but Boltanski and Capello push this forward. And what they do is they use Bourdieu's ideas of critical sociology to try and examine the language of managerial textbooks and managerial books in France. And they use this to try and identify different periods of capitalism in post-war Europe that correspond to what they call different spirits of capitalism. And obviously, as you can imagine, they identify a new spirit, that's in the title of the book, the new spirit of capitalism that corresponds to capitalism's most recent form, the neoliberal capitalism of the 1980s. And they examine this through these managerial textbooks. They look at language, they look at the various assumptions that kind of underpin this new form of capitalism. So what you can see in this book is that you can see, in a sense, a sort of an implicit critique of Gortz's idea that what's necessary to get beyond neoliberalism is the construction of autonomous, non-capitalist spaces. That's not adequate, because Boltanski and Capello argue that capitalism absorbs its own critique and generates, if you like, automatic responses to that critique, and that actually neoliberal capitalism and neoliberalism more generally has absorbed the idea of autonomy. And so arguing that the response to neoliberalism would be greater autonomy is simply to argue using the tools of neoliberalism. That's the kind of argument that Boltanski and Capello are making. And in response, what they say is that, well, what's necessary to counteract this tendency for the left's anti-capitalist critique to be co-opted by the kind of governing neoliberal discourse is a strong rule of law that's governed by a strong state. And this is where you can see a really unexpected link with Régis Debré's work. Now, later, when they were sort of interviewed about this in the early 2000s, Boltanski in particular sort of rolled back slightly his sort of commitment to the state as a potential protective force. What I think is interesting is that here's a conception of power that is adapting itself to some of the ways in which neoliberalism changed and some of the ways neoliberal ideas were expressed in the 1980s. And I think the great benefit of Boltanski and Capello's notion of a spirit, which they borrowed from the work of Max Weber, was that this idea of spirit explicitly addressed the ways in which the existing economic configuration was absorbing the arguments of its detractors, right? So they had a very minimal definition of capitalism in their book, but that meant that capitalism could easily adapt itself to any available ideological framework. And this, again, makes perfect sense when you look at the broader context, not just a context in which capitalism and neoliberalism and democracy seem to be triumphant, but also one in which national states seem to be less and less able to control the direction of the economy, and they had less control over global capital flows and financial markets and so on and so forth. And above all, I think what Boltanski and Capello did in their book was that they seemed to acknowledge the increasing fragmentation of power in a neoliberal world and the concomitant difficulty in constructing an effective and focused critique of that neoliberal world. And I think that's one of the reasons why the book was so successful amongst a whole variety of different anti-capitalist, left-wing Marxist organizations, because it gave this insight into why, not just what capitalism was, but why the critique didn't seem to stick, right? Why every time things went wrong, anti-capitalist movements didn't seem able to generate the kind of opposition that seemed so natural and obvious. Okay, turning finally to the last and probably most pessimistic of all the four books here, Pierre Dardot and Christian Laval's book, La Nouvelle Raison du Monde, which was published in the late 2000s. The big difference, I think, here between this book and the three previous books is that Dardot and Laval drew very heavily on the certain ideas that Michel Foucault developed in the late 1970s and which were republished in 2004 in a set of lectures that was very successful in France. And what Dardot and Laval do is they basically try and adopt what they describe as a Foucauldian approach to neoliberalism. And they argue that neoliberalism is a form of governing rationality. That's the words they use. Those are the words they use. And this means that neoliberalism is not just a dominant ideology that continuously finds new ways to justify itself, which is sort of the argument that Boltanski and Capello make, but that it actually governs the individual actions in a rationality of all those who live in its shadow. So it's a much bleaker and more pessimistic view. Now, this is sort of, it's consistent with the backgrounds of the two people who wrote this book. Laval is a professor of sociology in Paris. He began his career work on the history of utilitarianism. And he began to get very involved on the French far left as an activist and a scholar. And he set up various Marx study groups, the explicit aims of which were to provide a forum for the elaboration of new critical thought. And it's here that he met his collaborator Pierre Dardot, another philosopher with no formal academic affiliation, but somebody who'd been very involved with similar anti-capitalist and Marxist groups. And what their text, this quite influential text, tried to do was sort of fuse that philosophical and historical approach together. Now, obviously, as you can well imagine, the idea of this omnipresent neoliberal rationality raises a number of quite difficult questions, not least one of agency, right? And it's very difficult to build a movement if you think that neoliberal rationality is everywhere and as it has sort of penetrated every person. How on earth does one think beyond that, right? Now, Dardot and Laval, of course, since then have tried to address that, particularly they've written quite a lot about the commons. I know you're going to, Sophia and Andreas later are going to talk to you about the commons, and perhaps there's some interesting bridge between these two lectures that you're hearing today. But in this book, which is really kind of supposed to be a surgical dissection of neoliberalism, they offer very little in the way of agency. We're all, in a sense, we're all caught in this neoliberal rationality. But from the perspective of the talk that I'm giving today, their very diffuse conception of power does at least confirm the changing direction of French anti-capitalist discourses. And of the four texts, this is undoubtedly the one in which power is the most obviously decentralized, atomized, and diffuse. And there's actually some overlap with André Gortz, who gets a favorable mention on the very last page of the book. But few other contemporary French anti-capitalist thinkers have gone so far in their sort of radical decentering of power. And I think it's no surprise that this book should have come out in the slipstream of the financial crisis, when there seemed to have been so little in the way of response to this enormous crisis of capitalism, very visible crisis of capitalism. To people like Dardot and Laval, capitalism seemed to have survived yet again in very unpropitious circumstances, with the collusion of the state through bailouts and austerity measures. And more than ever before, anti-capitalist thinkers like Dardot and Laval were forced to reckon with neoliberalism as this kind of all-pervasive rationality, the power of which seemed to be located nowhere and everywhere at the same time. All right, I realize I'm at the end of my half hour, so I'm going to bring things to a close with a very short conclusion, trying to tie these different threads together and tie these different books together. So obviously the texts which I've talked about that form the basis of my analysis are four amongst many. I could have picked any number of different texts. Those of you who know about French intellectual life in the 90s, 80s, 90s, 2000s will know that there were a whole lot of other people who have reflected on these questions. Pierre Bourdieu would be one of the most obvious, but we could also talk about the sort of leading thinkers of French theory, Derrida, Deleuze, Lacan, people like this. But I think what's interesting about these texts is that they form a kind that they were all interventions. They were all very successful interventions that had had a very strong echo in French society and French political life at the moments in which they came out. And what they do is they illuminate the ways in which older forms of structural, revolutionary, or class-based Marxist critiques were adapted to fit a changing and really quite hostile socio-political configuration. And I think they show how this the French left, these French left-wing intellectuals tried to create these imaginative, these pragmatic, or these utopian solutions to the dominant, what they saw as a dominant neoliberal ideology of the time. Now, the four texts also shed some light on the kind of specific pathways that French thinkers have adopted in order to move beyond the concerns of a previous generation of intellectuals. And obviously, as an intellectual historian, I'm quite interested in these pathways. How do you get from A to B? So look, in the case of André Gortz, he reworked some of the ideas of Sartre and took them and adapted them for the context of the late 70s and early 80s. Régis Debray tried to inject the revolutionary zeal of his youthful third worldism into French republicanism, which until then was not necessarily a kind of revolutionary ideology, but he tries to bring that revolutionary fervor to it by showing how it could be an anti-capitalist force. But Dostoevsky and Capello, as I mentioned already, they kind of refine Bourdieu's critical sociology and put it to work and in analyzing capitalism, which is something that Bourdieu didn't do very much until late in life. And of course, Dardo and Laval extend the work of Michel Foucault, who in the late 1970s, early 80s was quite interested in neoliberalism. Whether he was a critic of neoliberalism or not is something that is very much under discussion, and there's a lot of sort of historiographical argument about that. But what's quite clear is that Dardo and Laval, they see themselves in the slipstream of a Foucauldian critique. And actually, I think this suggests that French political thought didn't kind of experience these cliche kind of disappearance of Marx or death of the subject themes, which you often read about French thought in this period. Rather, this new generation of critical thinkers was forced to elaborate these more sophisticated, decentralized, and fragmented conceptions of power that would fit better with the reality of things like identity politics and new social movement and the coming apart of the left-right divide. So what they're ultimately trying to do is first try to elaborate this less unified view of power, this less sort of Manichaean view of power, a more sophisticated idea of power, in order ultimately to develop finer and sharper ways of criticizing that system. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.